Hi, this is Farah Madin from Vista Access Architects. This is a very short video to discuss the new car parking requirements that are in Schedule 4 of SEPP Housing 2021. First, just a very brief background on car parking requirements that have been changing in the SEPP since a while now. In the 2004 version, it was considered to be appropriate to have a 3.2 meter car parking space. In the 2021 version, the requirement was 2890 Part 6 2009, which is your 2.4 meter car parking space with a 2.4 meter shade zone. And in the current 2024 version, there are different requirements for Class 1A and for other type of buildings. And then it's also based on a group size, which has a combination requirements of 3.2 meters wide parking spaces and 2890 Part 6 2009 version of car parking spaces. Before we discuss the version of car parking spaces required, it's important to understand that the SEPP actually has a section called the dictionary. And in the dictionary section, they have the applicable version of the standards. So for example, in the SEPP, the majority of the SEPP references mainly two Australian standards. The first one is 1428 Part 1. The most current version of 1428 Part 1 is the 2001 version, and the definition actually references it. And it also references 2890 Part 6 for the car parking standard. Now, the most current version of the car parking standard is actually a 2022 version, which is not referenced in this SEPP. There is also seems to be a bit of discrepancy in the definitions itself. For example, 1428 Part 1, it notes that as adopted in the Building Code of Australia, but in the Building Code of Australia 2021 version is not adopted. The 2009 version is adopted. So there's certainly it's trying to provide clarity, but I think it's still a bit confusing because of the way that it's structured. So going into the Class 1B requirements, there are a few requirements there. The first one is it needs to be at least a 3.2 meters wide car parking space. It needs to have a height of 2.5 meters. It needs to have a level surface of a gradient of 1 in 40 in any direction. And then it needs to be capable of being a 3.8 meter space without having to do some major structural remodifications to a building. So some of my observations on this particular section is that it doesn't specifically say Class 1A, but leaves it at 1. And I have a feeling that it's probably relating only to Class 1A, because if it was a Class 1A, there's a good chance that it would need to be a fully accessible car parking space. It also mentions a head height of 2.5 meters, which is fair enough, but 2890 Part 6, which is the other car parking standard, actually has different height requirements based on this section. So that's a bit of a difference. It also does not specify the permissibility of a 1 in 30 grade, which AS 2890 Part 6 actually permits in case it's bitumen. And the biggest one, in my opinion, is that it does not specify that you need to actually have step-free access from the car parking space to the dwelling. Now, this might be a no-brainer, but it's not actually spelled out anyway as being a requirement. So let's see what it actually means to have that requirement translate into design for a Class 1 dwelling. The way I look at it, there are a few options available, and we can discuss that in a bit more detail. One of the options is you can have your 3.2 meter space right there in your garage. You could potentially have easily removable storage to one side, therefore not reducing it less than 3.2 meters, but then you also have the flexibility of removing the storage at a later date, which does not involve any structural modification to gain your 3.8 meter wide car parking space. Now again, as I mentioned before, it doesn't specifically say that you need to have step-free access from that car parking space to within the dwelling, which means you would have to have a door threshold, a compliant door threshold, but we can assume that that's what the intention is here. Another option could be something like a carport, whereby you still have your 3.2 meter wide car parking space, and then in the future you have the potential of making it 3.8 meters wide, as long as you're not doing any structural modification. So it would have to be clear of posts or any other structural support in the section that requires the widening. Another option could be having a parking space on the driveway itself. As long as you have your 3.2 meter wide space and your driveway grade is of a maximum 1 in 40 in any direction, you have the clear head height happening, and then you could potentially use part of the landscaping area so that in the future you could widen it to 3.8 meters with minor modifications, and again, there are no structural modifications involved. For all other building types, and including Class 1A as well, that are not in a group, there is a clause that states that all of those car parking spaces need to be 2890 Part 6 compliant, which again, as a reminder, is your 2.4 meters parking space with a 2.4 meter shade zone. And then we have a different set of requirements for two different types of groups. A group between 2 and 7 car parking spaces, and then more than 8 and more car parking spaces. So if you have a group of 2 to 7 car parking spaces, point number 1, you need to have one car parking space that is 2890 Part 6 compliant. And then 50% of the car parking spaces must comply either with Part 6 or be at least 3.2 meters wide. Now, some of my observations in this particular clause are, if you remember for the Class 1, when it was like in a part of a dwelling, they mentioned a clear head height of 2.5 meters. Nowhere in this clause it actually mentions that the 3.2 meter wide space needs the 2.5 meters head height. This might be an accidental misprint, but it doesn't specifically say that in this clause. Again, the Part 6, if you have a car parking space that complies with Part 6, you are permitted to have a grade of 1 in 33 if it's bitumen. That same requirement or that same concession does not seem to be applied to a 3.2 meter wide car parking space. So let's see what that looks like in terms of car parking spaces. In the image above, the one in the red is your Part 6 compliant car parking space, and the one in blue is your 3.2 meters wide car parking space. So if your development has a requirement for 2 car parking spaces, as a minimum, one needs to be Part 6 compliant. The other one can be either Part 6 compliant or 3.2 meters wide. Another option is both of them designed as per Part 6. We take another example, say we are looking at 4 required car parking spaces. So the first one is always Part 6 compliance, that's the one in the red, and then 50% of 4 is true, and you can have the option of both of them being 3.2 meters wide, or you can have one of them as 3 meters wide and one of them as Part 6 wide. So that's what it means in terms of requirements, and this only applies to a group of 2 to 7. For a group of 8 or more, the formula is different. At the least, 15% of the car parking spaces have to be Part 6 compliant, and then 50% of the car parking spaces have the option of complying either with Part 6 or with 3.2 meters width. Again, the same observations here as well. The clause again does not mention a 2.5 meter clear head height for the 3.2 meter wide parking space, and also does not specify permissibility of a 1 in 32 grade for the 3.2 meter wide parking space. So let's see what does this new formula mean for spaces that are in group of 8 or more. So let's assume, for example, that your development has a requirement of 8 car parking spaces. So for 8 car parking spaces, the first 15% are required to be Part 6 compliant, So 15% of 8 is 1.2, rounding it up to 2. The first two are required to be Part 6 compliant. Then 50% of 8 is 4. For the remainder 4, we have an option of combinations that you can use, either Part 6 or you can use 3.2 meter spaces. There is also a clause that talks about avoiding doubt, but in my opinion, it just creates more doubt. There is no definition of what constitutes a group. I can only assume it means 2 or more, but there is no definition that actually states that in the document. There is also a lot of different interpretations that I'm coming across, some of them being that if spaces are separated by columns in a car parking lot, then they could potentially be considered to be separate groups. Or are spaces on one particular floor level of a basement considered to be a separate group? So a definition for a group is definitely needed, and at this point of time, I would suggest anything 2 or more, regardless of the number of floor levels, is considered to be one group. Visitor car parking is not mandatory, but when you do provide visitor car parking, then at least 5% are required to comply with Part 6. The visitor parking is required to have the international symbol for access, but apart from the visitor parking, this international symbol of access is not required to any other car parking space under the SEPP. There are also some requirements for vehicle barriers if there is multiple car parking spaces, and then there's also some requirement for power operated doors. One of the observations that I have in this section is that the visitor car parking in a common area behind a vehicular barrier may actually create an operational issue, and that's not been addressed in this clause. Some final observations. Nowhere is it actually noted that the car parking spaces are actually to be connected via an accessible path of travel to the dwelling, other than the fact that there is a statement that states that car parking is considered to be a common area, and therefore we assume that the common area needs to be linked by an accessible path of travel. Another point is that the Schedule 4 doesn't actually reference the clause 108, which has the car parking requirements. So the numbers that we are talking about, the formulas that we are talking about, is based on the number that is generated by one car parking space for 5 dwellings for a social housing provider or Landcom, and 0.5 parking spaces for each of the bedroom if it is not by a social housing provider. That should have been specifically noted in Schedule 4. And the last point is that even though there is an exemption for not providing an international symbol of access to the Part 6 compliant car parking spaces, there is no exemption for bollard not to be provided. And I think that should have been provided as well, because in many circumstances, provision of bollard is unnecessary. That wraps up the car parking section of the SEPP. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop me an email on admin@accessarchitects.com.au. Thank you.